Saint Augustine in the City of God, Book 12, Created Wills and the Distinction of Good and Evil. In the previous book, we saw something of the beginning of the two cities so far as angels are concerned. In the same way, we must now proceed to the creation of men and see the beginning of the city so far as it concerns the kind of rational creatures who are mortal. First, however, a few remarks about the angels must be made in order to make it as clear as I can how there is no real difficulty or impropriety in speaking of a single society composed of both men and angels, and why, therefore, it is right to say that there are not 4 cities or societies, namely, 2 of angels and 2 of men, but only 2, one of them made up of the good, both angels and men, and the other of those who are evil. There is no reason to doubt that the contrary dispositions which have developed among these good and bad angels are due, not to different natures and origins, for God the author and creator of all substances has created them both, but to the dissimilar choices and desires of these angels themselves. Some, remaining faithful to God, the common good of all, have lived in the enjoyment of his eternity, truth, and love, while others, preferring the enjoyment of their own power, as though they were their own good, departed from the higher good and common blessedness for all, and turned to goods of their own choosing. Preferring the pomp of pride to the sublimity of eternity, the craftiness of vanity to the certainty of truth, and the turmoil of dissension to the union of love, they became proud, deceitful, and envious. Since the happiness of all angels consists in union with God, it follows that their unhappiness must be found in the very contrary, that is, in not adhering to God. To the question, why are the good angels happy? The right answer is, because they adhere to God. To the question, why are the others unhappy? The answer is because they do not adhere to God. In fact, there is no other good which can make any rational or intellectual creature happy except God. Not every creature has the potentialities for happiness. Beasts, trees, stones, and such things neither acquire nor have the capacity for this gift. However, every creature which has this capacity receives it not from itself, since it has been created out of nothing but from its Creator. To possess him is to be happy, to lose him is to be in misery, and of course that one whose beatitude depends upon himself as his own good and not on any other good can never be unhappy, since he can never lose himself. Thus, there can be no unchangeable good except our one true and blessed God. All things which he has made are good because made by him. They are subject to change because they were made not out of him but out of nothing. Although they are not supremely good, since God is a greater good than they, these mutable things are nonetheless highly good by reason of their capacity for union with, and therefore beatitude in, the immutable good, which is so completely their good that without this good, misery is inevitable. But it does not follow that other creatures in the universe are better off merely because they are incapable of misery. That would be like saying that other members of the body are better than the eyes because they can never become blind. A sentient nature, even in pain, is better than a stone that cannot suffer. In the same way, a rational nature, even in misery, is higher than one which, because it lacks reason or sensation, cannot suffer misery. This being the case, it is nothing less than a perversion of the nature of the angels if they do not adhere to God. For remember, their nature is so high in the order of creation that, mutable as it is, it can attain beatitude by adhering to the immutable and supreme good, which is God, and that unless it achieves beatitude, this nature fails to satisfy its inmost exigencies, and finally, that nothing but God can satisfy these needs of the angelic nature. Now, this perversion, like every imperfection in a nature, harms nature, and therefore is contrary to the nature. It follows, therefore, that what makes the wicked angels differ from the good ones is not their nature, but a perversion or imperfection, and that this very blemish is a proof of how highly to be esteemed is the nature itself. Certainly, no blemish in a thing ought to be blamed unless we are praising the thing as a whole, for the whole point of blaming the blemish is that it mars the perfection of something we would like to see praised. For example, when we say that blindness is a defect of the eyes, we imply that it is the very nature of the eyes to see. And when we say that deafness is a malady of the ears, we are supposing that it is their nature to hear. So too, when we say that it is a failure in an angel not to attain union with God, we openly proclaim that they were meant by nature to be one with God. Of course, no one can fully comprehend or properly express the ineffable union of being one with God in his life, in his wisdom, in his joy, and all this without a shadow of death or darkness or disturbance. One thing is certain, the very failure of the bad angels to cling to God, a desertion that damaged their nature like a disease, is itself proof enough that the nature of God gave them was good, so good that not to be one with God was for them a disaster. The very failure of the bad angels to cling to God, a desertion that damaged their nature like a disease, is itself proof enough that the nature God gave them was good, so good that not to be one with God was for them a disaster. Chapter 2. This explanation just given seemed to me necessary to forestall the objection that the apostate spirits might have received from some principle other than God, a nature different from that of the other natures, that of the other angels. The malice of this mistake can be more easily and speedily removed, the more clearly one grasps that what God meant by the words, "I am who am," spoken through the medium of an angel at the time when Moses was being sent to the children of Israel. Since God is supreme being, that is, since he supremely is and therefore is immutable, it follows that he gave being to all that he created out of nothing, not, however, absolute being. To some things he gave more of being and to others less, and in this way arranged an order of natures in a hierarchy of being. This noun being is derived from the verb to be, just as wisdom from the verb to be wise. In Latin, essentia, being a new word not used by the ancient writers, recently adopted in order to find an equivalent of the Greek ousia, of which essentia is the exact translation. Consequently, no nature, except a non-existent one, can be contrary to the nature which is supreme and which created whatever other natures have being. In other words, non-entity stands in opposition to that which is. Therefore, there is no being opposed to God, who is the supreme being and source of all beings without exception. Consequently, no nature, except a non-existent one, can be contrary to the nature which is supreme and which created whatever other natures have being. In other words, non-entity stands in opposition to that which is. Therefore, there is no being opposed to God, who is the supreme being and source of all beings, without exception.